When my mother looked me straight in the eyes at our family dinner and said, "Face it, Skylar, you'll never be loved by anyone who matters," she had no idea that the man I'd been secretly engaged to for 6 months was about to walk through that door. And he wasn't just anyone, he was the billionaire CEO she'd been desperately trying to impress for years. My name is Skylar, and this is the story of how one cruel sentence from my mother became the catalyst for the most satisfying moment of my entire life. Picture this: the grand dining room of my family's estate in the Hamptons, crystal chandeliers casting golden light over a table set for 12, and my mother, Eleanor Whitmore, holding court like the social queen she's always believed herself to be. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was about to learn that the daughter she'd spent 30 years diminishing had been playing a game she never saw coming. It all began 6 months earlier, when I met James Alexander at a charity auction in Manhattan. Not James Alexander the investment banker or James Alexander the trust fund baby, James Alexander, the self-made tech billionaire whose company had just revolutionized sustainable energy. The same James Alexander my mother had been name-dropping at dinner parties for 2 years, claiming they were close family friends when they'd never even been properly introduced. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that dinner, to the moment everything changed. The Whitmore family monthly dinner was a tradition as old and rigid as the mahogany table we sat around. My parents, my brother Marcus with his perfect lawyer wife, my sister Charlotte with her successful surgeon husband, and me, 32-year-old Skylar, the perpetual disappointment who worked as a freelance graphic designer and lived in a modest apartment in Brooklyn instead of a mansion in Manhattan. "So Charlotte," my mother began, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted everyone to pay attention, "tell us about the hospital fundraiser. I heard Senator Mitchell was there?" Charlotte beamed, her diamond earrings catching the light. "Oh yes, Mother. David introduced me to half the political elite in New York. We raised over $2 million for the children's wing." My mother practically glowed with pride. "Wonderful, darling. And Marcus, how are things at the firm?" "Excellent," my brother replied, adjusting his Armani tie. "I just closed the Morrison merger. Largest deal in the firm's history. Rachel and I are looking at that penthouse on Park Avenue." As always, the attention turned to me last, like an afterthought. "And Skylar," my mother's voice dropped several degrees in warmth, "how's your little art project business?" The way she said "little art project" made my teeth clench. I'd built a successful freelance career, working with major brands and earning more than most people my age. But because I didn't wear designer suits to a corner office, my success was invisible to her. "It's going well, Mother. I just finished a campaign for—" "That's nice, dear," she interrupted, already losing interest. "You know, Mrs. Henderson's daughter just got engaged to a neurosurgeon. Such a lovely couple. They're having the wedding at the plaza." The implication hung in the air like expensive perfume. Another successful daughter, another impressive marriage, another reminder of what I wasn't. Speaking of engagements, Charlotte chimed in with false sweetness, "Skylar, are you seeing anyone special?" The question I'd been dreading. The one that always came up at these gatherings, usually followed by helpful suggestions about dating apps or concerned discussions about my biological clock. "I'm dating someone," I said quietly, taking a sip of wine to steady my nerves. My mother's eyebrows raised with skeptical interest. "Oh? And what does he do?" This was it. The moment I could have told them about James, about our whirlwind romance that had started with a bidding war over a vintage Chanel dress at the charity auction and evolved into the deepest connection I'd ever felt with another person. I could have mentioned the private jets, the weekend trips to his vineyard in Napa, the way he looked at me like I was the most fascinating woman in the world. Instead, I hesitated. "He works in technology," I said, which was technically true. Marcus snorted into his wine glass. Let me guess, another broke startup guy who's going to change the world with some app nobody needs? Marcus, my father warned mildly, but his tone suggested amusement rather than disapproval. I'm just saying, Marcus continued, Skylar has a type. Remember the photographer who lived in his van? Or the musician who couldn't afford to take her anywhere nice? My face burned with embarrassment, but before I could defend myself, my mother delivered the blow that would change everything. Oh, sweetheart, she said with a laugh that held no warmth whatsoever, let's be realistic here. Face it, Skylar, you'll never be loved by anyone who matters. You're 32, you live in Brooklyn, and you draw pictures for a living. The kind of men who could actually provide for you, who move in our social circles, who have real influence, they want women like Charlotte. Accomplished women with proper careers and social connections. The silence that followed was deafening. Even my usually diplomatic father looked uncomfortable. Men of substance want partners who enhance their reputation, my mother continued, seemingly oblivious to the cruelty of her words. They want wives who can host proper dinner parties, who understand how society works, who can be assets to their careers. And unfortunately, darling, that's just not you. Charlotte and Marcus exchanged glances across the table, both looking mortified but not brave enough to contradict our mother. I mean, look at Charlotte, mother gestured toward my sister. David fell in love with her mind first, her medical knowledge, her social grace, her ability to connect with his colleagues. That's what sophisticated men want. My hands were shaking as I gripped my wine glass. 30 years of subtle put-downs and backhanded compliments had led to this moment, my own mother telling me I was fundamentally unlovable to anyone who mattered. You're being cruel, Eleanor, my father finally said, his voice quiet but firm. I'm being honest, William, she replied without missing a beat. Better she hears it from family than continues living in fantasyland. The sooner Skylar accepts reality, the sooner she can adjust her expectations and find someone more suitable to her circumstances. That's when I heard the doorbell ring. James and I had planned this carefully. He was supposed to arrive at 8:30, exactly 90 minutes into dinner, when the conversation would inevitably turn to my personal life. What we hadn't planned was my mother's particularly vicious attack on my worthiness of love. Perfect timing, actually. I wonder who that could be, my mother mused, glancing at her Cartier watch. We're not expecting anyone. Our longtime housekeeper, Maria, appeared in the doorway looking slightly flustered. Mrs. Whitmore, there's a gentleman here to see Miss Skylar. He says he's expected? My mother's eyebrows shot up. A gentleman? For Skylar? Yes, ma'am. He's quite well dressed. I stood up slowly, my heart racing with anticipation. That would be James. I invited him to meet the family. James, my mother repeated, her voice sharp with suspicion. The technology man you mentioned? Yes, I said, smoothing my dress and walking toward the foyer. James Alexander. The name hit the dining room like a bomb going off. James Alexander? Charlotte gasped. As in Alexander Industries' James Alexander? The billionaire? Marcus's voice cracked slightly. My mother's face had gone completely white. Skylar, you don't mean James Alexander, the CEO of Alexander Industries? The man who just donated $50 million to the Met? I paused in the doorway, looking back at my family's shocked expressions. I suppose I should have been more specific about what he does in technology. And then I walked out to greet the man I'd fallen desperately in love with, leaving my family to process the fact that their greatest disappointment was apparently dating one of the most eligible bachelors in America. James stood in our marble foyer looking absolutely magnificent in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his dark hair slightly tousled from the October wind. When he saw me, his face lit up with that smile that never failed to make my heart skip. "Hello, beautiful," he said, pulling me into his arms for a kiss that made me forget about every cruel word my mother had ever spoken. "Ready for this?" I whispered against his lips. "With you?" "I'm ready for anything," he replied, his green eyes sparkling with mischief. We walked back into the dining room hand in hand, and I watched my family's expressions cycle through disbelief, recognition, and dawning horror as they realized exactly who was standing in their dining room. "Everyone," I said with perfect composure, "I'd like you to meet my fiancé, James Alexander." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. James stepped forward with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms full of powerful people. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, it's such a pleasure to finally meet you. Skylar talks about her family constantly." My father was the first to recover, standing up and extending his hand with the practiced grace of a lifetime spent in social situations. "Mr. Alexander, this is quite a surprise. Welcome to our home." "Thank you," James replied, his handshake firm and confident. "I apologize for the unexpected visit, but Skylar wanted to share some news with the family, and I couldn't wait another day to meet the people who raised the woman I'm going to marry." Charlotte made a small squeaking sound that might have been an attempt at congratulations. Marcus stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. "Mr. Alexander, I'm Marcus Whitmore, Skylar's brother. This is my wife Rachel. We're both huge admirers of your work with sustainable energy." "Please, call me James," he replied graciously. "And thank you. The work is challenging but incredibly rewarding. Though nothing compared to what your sister does." My mother, who had remained frozen in her chair like a statue, finally found her voice. "I'm sorry, did you say, fiancé?" James smiled and squeezed my hand. 6 months ago, I had the incredible fortune to meet Skylar at a charity auction. She was bidding on a vintage Chanel dress for a client's photo shoot, and I found myself competing with her just for an excuse to start a conversation. "She won, by the way," he continued, looking at me with such obvious adoration that even Charlotte sighed romantically. "Cost me $12,000, but it was worth every penny to see her victory smile." We spent the entire evening talking, I added, finding my confidence again with James beside me. About art, about technology, about changing the world through beautiful design and sustainable innovation. "I proposed 3 months later," James said, his voice warm with the memory. "I couldn't imagine spending another day without knowing she'd be my wife." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Actually, that's why I'm here tonight. Skylar wanted to share the news with her family before we made any public announcements." My mother's eyes widened as James opened the box to reveal a stunning emerald-cut diamond surrounded by smaller stones, set in platinum. The ring was easily 10 carats and probably worth more than my parents' house. "Oh my God," Charlotte whispered. That's the most beautiful ring I've ever seen." "It belonged to my grandmother," James explained as I slipped it onto my finger for the first time in front of my family. "She always said it was waiting for the right woman." The moment I met Skylar, I knew she was the one. My mother stared at the ring like it might bite her. "This is quite unexpected." "I know it's sudden," James said diplomatically. "But when you know, you know." And I knew from our first conversation that Skylar was unlike anyone I'd ever met. Her creativity, her intelligence, her complete lack of pretension, she's everything I never knew I was looking for, he continued, his voice carrying the sincerity that had made me fall in love with him. "In my world, I'm surrounded by people who want something from me. But Skylar? She didn't even know who I was that first night. She fell in love with James the person, not James the CEO. Marcus cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Alexander, James, this is wonderful news. When's the wedding? We're thinking spring, I replied, still getting used to the weight of the ring on my finger. Something intimate and beautiful. Actually, James added with a grin, we were hoping the family might have some suggestions. Skylar mentioned you hosted Charlotte's wedding here at the estate? It looked absolutely magical in the photos. My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. 20 minutes ago, she'd been telling me I'd never be loved by anyone who mattered. Now the most eligible bachelor in New York was asking for her help planning our wedding. Of course, she managed to stammer. We'd be honored to help with the arrangements. Wonderful, James beamed. I have to warn you, though, we're thinking big. All of Skylar's artistic vision combined with unlimited resources? This could be the wedding of the century. Charlotte leaned forward eagerly. Skylar, you have to tell us everything. How did you propose? Where did you go for your first date? For the next hour, I watched my family transform before my eyes. Suddenly, my career was fascinating and so creative. My apartment was charming and artistic. My lifestyle choices were refreshingly authentic. James played his part perfectly, praising my work to a captive audience that hung on his every word. He showed them photos on his phone of a corporate headquarters I designed branding for, mentioning casually that my concepts had increased their brand recognition by 40%. Skylar's mind works differently than anyone I'd ever met, he explained to my rapt family. She sees possibilities where others see problems. It's revolutionized how I think about design in our own company. My mother, desperate to salvage some dignity from the evening, tried to insert herself into the conversation. You know, James, I've always supported Skylar's artistic pursuits. I think creativity is so important. The lie was so blatant that my father actually choked on his wine. That's wonderful to hear, James replied diplomatically. Skylar mentioned how encouraging you've all been of her unconventional path. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. James knew exactly what my family thought of my choices. I'd told him everything during one of our long conversations on his yacht. He was being gracious for my sake, but I could see the steel beneath his polite smile. As the evening wound down, James stood up and buttoned his jacket. This has been absolutely wonderful, but I have an early flight to London tomorrow. Skylar, shall we? Of course, I replied, gathering my purse and jacket. London? My mother asked weakly. Business meetings, James explained. Though we're hoping to turn it into a romantic weekend. I want to show Skylar the gallery space I'm considering for my art collection. James collects contemporary art, I added casually. He's particularly interested in supporting emerging female artists. My mother's eyes lit up with desperate calculation. How wonderful. You know, Skylar has so many talented friends in the art world. Perhaps you'd be interested in meeting some of them? Actually, James said with perfect timing, I'm planning to commission Skylar to curate the entire collection. Her eye for talent is extraordinary. The commission would be worth millions, though I was the only one who knew that. To my family, it sounded like James was trusting me with one of his most prestigious projects. As we prepared to leave, my mother pulled me aside while James was saying goodbye to my father. Skylar, darling, she whispered urgently, I hope you know that everything I said earlier was just maternal concern. I was only trying to protect you from disappointment. I looked at this woman who had spent 3 decades making me feel small and inadequate, who had told me just hours earlier that I would never be loved by anyone who mattered. I know exactly what you were trying to do, Mother, I replied quietly. The question is, do you? Before she could respond, James appeared at my side, slipping his arm around my waist with protective tenderness. "Ready, darling?" he asked. "More than ready," I replied. As we walked toward the door, I heard my mother call out desperately, "Skylar, we should have lunch this week. Plan the engagement party." I turned back with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I'll have my assistant call yours, Mother." The look of confusion on her face was priceless. She had no idea that James had insisted on hiring me a full-time assistant to manage my increasingly busy schedule, or that my little art project business was about to become one of the most sought-after design firms in the city. James and I walked out into the crisp October evening, and he pulled me close as his driver opened the car door. "So," he said, his eyes twinkling with mischief, "how do you think that went?" I burst into laughter, all the tension of the evening finally releasing. "Did you see her face when you mentioned the ring belonged to your grandmother?" "I thought she might faint," he admitted, helping me into the back of his Bentley. "Though I have to say, your timing was perfect. If I'd arrived 5 minutes earlier, I would have missed that charming speech about how you'll never be loved by anyone who matters." My laughter died in my throat. "You heard that?" "Maria let me in through the kitchen," he said gently, taking my hands in his. "I was waiting in the hallway when your mother decided to share her opinion of your romantic prospects." I felt tears prick at my eyes, the old hurt rising up despite the evening's triumph. "Hey," James said softly, lifting my chin so I had to meet his gaze. "Look at me, Skylar. Your mother was wrong about everything. You are loved by someone who matters, you're loved by someone who would give up everything for you." "Even your billions?" I teased, trying to lighten the mood. "Especially my billions," he replied seriously. "Money is just numbers in accounts, Skylar. But what we have, what you've brought into my life, that's irreplaceable." As our car pulled away from my family's estate, I reflected on the strange turns life can take. 6 months ago, I was the family disappointment, the daughter who couldn't get her life together, the woman who would never be loved by anyone who mattered. Tonight, I was engaged to a man who saw my worth from the very beginning, who celebrated my unconventional path instead of trying to change it, who loved me not despite my differences but because of them. But here's the twist that makes this story even more perfect, the part my family will never know. James didn't just happen to be at that charity auction 6 months ago. He'd been quietly commissioning my work for over a year, routing projects through intermediaries because he didn't want me to feel pressured by his wealth. He'd fallen in love with my creative vision long before he fell in love with me. That night at the auction? He wasn't bidding on the dress to meet me, he was there because he knew I'd be there, and he'd finally worked up the courage to introduce himself as just James, not James Alexander the billionaire. Every romantic gesture, every thoughtful surprise, every moment that felt like a fairy tale, it was all real, but it was also the result of a man who had spent months learning what made me happy before he ever said hello. My mother thought I'd never be loved by anyone who mattered because I wasn't conventional enough, successful enough, polished enough for her world. She had no idea that the most powerful man she'd ever met had been quietly falling in love with exactly those qualities she found so disappointing. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving your critics wrong, it's discovering they never understood what made you valuable in the first place. My name is Skylar, and I'm not just a success story. I'm proof that the right person will love you not despite your differences, but because of them. And sometimes, just sometimes, that person happens to be a billionaire who's been secretly admiring your work for over a year. They say love finds you when you least expect it. In my case, love had been finding me for months, I just didn't know it yet. The ultimate revelation that James had been commissioning Skylar's work for over a year before they met, making their chance encounter actually the result of his long-distance admiration for her talents, proves that she was already valued by someone who mattered long before her family's cruel dinner.